Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Maggie Smith and Rainesford Stauffer. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of nearly 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Maggie Smith is the award-winning author of several books, including You Could Make This Place Beautiful, Good Bones, and Keep Moving, Notes on Loss and Lost Creativity and Change. A 2011 recipient of a Creative Writing Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, Maggie is the recipient of multiple awards and prizes and has been widely published, appearing in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, The Nation, the Best American Poetry, and more. FAN hosted Maggie in 2020, right at almost the beginnings of COVID, when Keep Moving was published, and we're thrilled to welcome her back to FANland. Rainesford Stauffer is an author, journalist, speaker, and Kentuckian. She's the work-in-progress columnist for Teen Vogue and wrote a column for Catapult called Gold Stars. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Scalawag, Deem magazine, Vox, and other publications. She's the author of An Ordinary Age, Finding Your Way in a World That Expects the Exceptional, and was a 2022-23 Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism. FAN had the pleasure of hosting Rainesford for an event in 2021 when An Ordinary Age was published. And now let's welcome Maggie Smith and Rainesford Stauffer.
Oh, Lonnie, what an introduction, and what a joy to get to be here with you. It's odd that we get to have a discussion about ambition after hearing our bios read, which I didn't really think about, the sort of like deep appropriateness / irony of that. It's like, here's a list of accomplishments. Now let's talk about ambition.
And what I love about the bio that stresses me out a little bit every time is the decision on what gets included, what's just too much. It's very interesting to have to hear the work you do that I don't know about you, but I would assume feels like work read back in kind of this list of this and this and this. And I do think that it creates some very ironic but lovely context to kind of frame this conversation.
Yes, I am often embarrassed by my bio. And so I have been known at book festivals and before readings, when the person who's introducing me has it in hand, they will hand it to me for confirmation, and I will actually line out half of it because I'm like, no one needs to know all of that. Like, they probably know they're here for a reason. So we don't have to say all those things. And I think there is this strange, deep, probably gendered, frankly, thing that makes me feel like I don't want anyone to think I'm too big for my britches. We don't need to mention all these things that one has accomplished beforehand. So it's a perfect intro.
I think it's so true, because I think it's a fine line, or at least it feels like a fine line to me, where you want to take up space. I say tentatively. I think I'm supposed to want that. I struggle very much with that. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of the fact that on social media or in conversations or in different parts of our lives, we all know by now that it can look like one thing, it can feel like something a little bit different. And I always find that tension very interesting. But to go even deeper on this, this is such a funny segue. I love it. Can you tell me a little bit about what your relationship with ambition is like right now, and if it's changed over the last little bit?
You know, I think it actually has changed. And I know I've talked about this because when I read, okay, I'm going to do the thing. When I read all the Gold Stars, and I felt so lucky to get to read that book early, like to get in on the ground floor of reading an early copy of that book, I saw so much of myself in it. And I think I wrote you back and said, okay, I've always been ambitious. I'm a firstborn daughter, right? I'm a writer. I'm self-employed. I'm a single parent. So there is this kind of like necessary hustle when you're self-employed, and when you're a single parent, I think that necessary hustle is sort of compounded. So my ambition is not really hoping for a promotion or a raise, because who would give it to me? Myself. My ambition, I think more creatively is about, like, I think I proved to myself what I needed to prove to myself. Like, I'm a real writer. I don't feel like Pinocchio the wooden boy anymore, as I think I did in my 20s, particularly. But right now, what I really want to do is do new things, surprise myself, take different risks with my work, sort of follow ideas that light me up. And I don't know that that's necessarily ambitious, but it is a kind of striving toward something. Um, all that said, I am so trying to prioritize rest
Yeah.
right now in a way that I don't think I've prioritized rest my entire life. Like, maybe it's okay to have a day that is quote unquote not productive. Like, maybe it's okay not to live and die by a to-do list and the notes function on my iPhone. Maybe it's okay if I am writing a little less than I was a year ago, or publishing a little less than I was a year ago. I mean, just trying to sort of be a little bit more gentle with
Mm.
myself. That's the kind of season I'm in right now. What about you?
First of all, I love the whole idea of gentle ambition. And I think that the ironic thing about all of this is that we know rest is so productive. I
Mm.
think that most of us, regardless of various career paths or life circumstances, I think most of us have probably had the moment where we needed to push through something. We needed that second gear, that hustle, and everything just fell apart, probably because we were under a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of time had elapsed without taking care of ourselves. And I think that most of us have wound up in a version of a dark place because of that. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about maybe not necessarily contextualizing it as ambition, but certainly a kind of striving toward different things, toward, it sounds like, your relationship with yourself and your work and productivity and all these things being a little bit different. Because I think that that's been the biggest shift for me over the past couple of years in particular, including the past almost year, not quite half a year of this book being out. I think that my earlier conception of ambition was really not about trying to obtain a goal. It was not about trying to be the best at anything. In fact, I've always been very clear that I am not. But I think that it was, number one, trying to prove that I was good enough for something, even if I couldn't identify what the something was. And I think that number two, was less about striving towards something and more striving not to fail. And
Mm.
it's honestly taken me this far into adulthood to make a distinction between what that looked like and how that felt, that there was a difference between worrying about going down this slippery slope of failure, of people being disappointed in me, of not knowing what I wanted to do, versus something that felt enthusiastic and curious and invigorating in different ways. And so I find myself more and more being ambitious in that direction, even if it looks different than I would have contextualized accomplishment. I'm also not publishing as much, but I'm pushing myself in my writing more. I'm not doing as much at work, but I'm investing in my friendships in different ways. And so I think, yeah, it's changed a lot. I hope that it's expanded. I hope my definition of ambition is not quite as narrow as it was at the outset of starting this project in particular.
Oh my gosh. This reminds me of a conversation I had. I think I was at the University of Arkansas, and I was doing a Q&A with grad students, and all of them were asking sort of like, what's the next step? What do I do next? Like, how do I publish a book? Do I get a PhD? And I don't know what they expected me to say in that moment, but I remember saying something like, what do you want your daily life to look like?
Mm.
And they all kind of looked at me like, what kind of professional advice is that? And it reminds me of something you wrote late in All the Gold Stars, which is, we all want better lives, right? So if we can frame ambition as like striving for a better life, what does that look like? And does having like 5 trophies necessarily give you that? Or does having that degree or that other award or that book or that job or that thing that might make you miserable but look great on paper. Like, is that the thing? And so I sat down with these students and just said, imagine your perfect day of work. Like, what does that look like? Do you like being around people? Do you want to teach? Like, do you want to be at the front of a room full of people? If you don't, then probably you don't want to go down that path. If that doesn't sound fun to you or invigorating, do you need to be by yourself a lot? Like, do you need to live in a certain part of the country? Do you need to be close to your family? Like, what really matters to you aside from all the other stuff that you would load onto your CV or resume? And they all, I think it was a little bit odd as a pep talk, but I believe in that. And I believe in that as someone who lives in her hometown. You know, I think sometimes I think I'm very ambitious, but probably if I were more ambitious, I wouldn't be living 20 minutes from my parents and 20 minutes from the hospital where I was born. I would have set out to have some sort of grand, quote unquote, life. But I think I knew deep down that that sort of rootedness was important to me.
I love this so much because I think that that's also a theme for me. A lot of my work now is based in Kentucky, which is where I'm from. The work I've gotten to do in my home, I shouldn't say out loud that I love it more than any other work I've gotten to do, but I kind of secretly do. And it took me a really long time to figure out what that meant and what that looked like in the context of how I kind of conceived of these two dueling ambitions, where I was supposed to be doing more, I was supposed to be pursuing more, I was supposed to be finding a full-time reporting job, even though we're watching round of layoffs after round of layoffs. It's awful and it's endless. Thank goodness for unions, very grateful for that. But it got to a point where I couldn't figure out what I was chasing anymore. And I think maybe a little bit more unnervingly, I couldn't figure out what this idea, what meaning it was supposed to hold for me. I do think that there was a point in my early 20s where I thought, I want to be a full-time writer and I want to do it at this publication and I want to live in this city and I want it to look like this. But over time, I realized that I was ambitious about other parts of my life just as much as I was ambitious about this pocket of my work. Turns out I really love working with student journalists. It's one of my favorite things in the world. I'm very close to my family. I'm very close to my friends, and having space for that, having the breathing room for that turned out to be a much bigger part of my adulthood than I would have guessed when I was first trying to start a career. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things that I think of now when I think about ambition. And I think that I had the privilege of talking to so many people at so many different life points for this book. And what I really loved was how many of them spoke about their ambition changing over time.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we get funneled onto this narrow track from the time a lot of us are very young with advanced classes and gold stars and all the grades, and you kind of choose your track in life almost, which is unsettling for so many reasons. But it makes changing your mind or moving toward what you need instead of what you were supposed to want feel like a failure. And so I love getting to hear people talk about how ambition has changed, what they've grown out of, what they've grown into.
It's funny. I didn't take AP classes. I remember my high school English teacher, when I did the MFA, said something to me when I visited his class. I went back to my high school and visited that class when I was getting my graduate degree. And we were kind of laughing about it because he was like, you know, you weren't really scholarly by nature. And no, I wasn't. I was going out to concerts on weeknights and having a great time and like getting good grades, but like really, let's be honest, sort of phoning it in because I had a fun social life. And I was not a joiner. So when I left high school, it's not like I had a list of like sports or clubs that I was part of. I did not. So in a lot of ways, I was not on a track at all, but I did, particularly as a firstborn and also just in my family, feel an enormous amount of pressure to do well. Like if you got a C and came home with a C, and said something like, well, it's a C is average, the response would be not for you. Right? Because we know that you're capable of more than that. So feeling pressure to sort of excel academically, I definitely felt. And it's honestly, it's impacted my parenting in a profound way. I mean, I have 2 kids and my daughter's like, should I take these AP classes my freshman year? And I'm like, why would you want to stress yourself out when you don't even know what high school is going to feel like yet? Like maybe just take the honors classes and the ones you really like. Do you really want to spend extra time doing algebra? Like, why stress yourself out? Like balance, you don't need to know what you want to do. You don't need to know what you're going to be or anything. Just slow down, enjoy your life. Don't stress yourself out. Things will fall into place. I have to be honest, I don't actually know if that's good advice. Like it may be that everyone else's parents who are telling them to take the AP classes and join 30 clubs, they will have better looking college applications, but my daughter is happy.
Yeah.
That's
And I think
priceless.
it is. And I think that honestly, if we're taking ambition back to this idea of wanting a better life, whatever that looks like for you, what more could any of us ask for really? And I think that honestly, that's an approach to ambition or to striving or to work that most of us don't learn until we've had everything kind of crash and burn. Again, whatever version of that looks like.
Yeah.
I often feel like I'm cheating because I was a student who had a lot of ambition and very few of the outcomes to show for that in an academic context. I was not the straight A kid. I was not the one that took all the APs. I went to college my first year. I dropped out right after, took a while to circle back and did that in a completely different way. And I felt a lot in retrospect of anxiety around that I hadn't stayed on track, that I wasn't doing a good enough job, that something had fallen apart. And the most interesting thing about it is I did not have parents who put a lot of stock in grades or merit awards or attendance awards or any of these things. They were very much of the variety where they wanted us to try. They wanted us to be good people, good friends, good community members, and anything else was a bonus. And I don't know where I internalized the idea that I was only worth something if I was working myself to the bone at everything, including things in retrospect I simply did not care that much about. But it's been the better part of a decade trying to figure out where that comes from. And now when I look at the young people that I know and work with who, oh my gosh, Maggie, they are leaps and bounds ahead in their understanding of life and context and nuance and what matters than I was probably even in my mid-20s, that it takes my breath away. And I watch the pressure and the stress of this narrow definition of achievement when all I see are these expansive young people who are already doing so much good, who are already thinking about things in such an important way. And I don't know, I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we cultivate that in systems that don't give any of us very much breathing room to explore that part of striving.
Oh, I love that. The kids are all right. Like I do. I think they have a sort of an innate sense of priorities. And I don't know if some of that has come from even just the past few years of having so much shut down on them during like peak pandemic, that you stop thinking that getting an A in bio is the be all end all when you can't even go outside and see your friends, or you're in hybrid school, or someone has gotten sick or passed away. I mean, it really, I think, shifted a lot of our priorities, but I see it with kids especially. I mean, it really, having things like that happen when you're so young, I think is so formative.
Absolutely. And I think, the intersection of the other things, they're growing up in the middle of a climate crisis, gun violence, where school shootings are not an uncommon thing. They're not an outrageous fear to have. It's actually quite reasonable. I think that on one hand, I always hesitate to say, I don't want to fall into the trap of saying the young people will save us, because I think that's way too much pressure. And I think that frankly, it is the adult's job to be taking care of them. And I don't say that to be dismissive of the leadership of young people. We need it. I want them to tell me what to do. I learn from them every single day. But it does seem to me that in general, and again, I know young people are not a monolith, but I love seeing the different ways they think about the impact of systemic issues, how that shapes things like who is striving and what are they striving for? What are the familial expectations? What's the context? These are not questions that I was asking when I was 16 or 17 years old.
Or 26 or 27.
Amen. And I'm very grateful that they are. And I also wish that we had more resources and more space and more support for them to work those things out on their own timetable without feeling like if it hasn't all happened by 18, if I don't know for sure by 18 or 21 or 25 or whatever it is, it's a wash and I'm lost.
Right. Well, and even just the sort of interpersonal ambition too, because I think that's something that I've definitely, not only did I think there was like a path professionally, I grew up believing, okay, so I need to meet someone, date them, get engaged, preferably in this order, get engaged, get married, then live together. It did not happen in that order. Have children, raise children, have a job that doesn't interfere with me raising the children, retire. I mean, all of these things. Like I think we're also given a kind of rubric or a kind of syllabus of the way that our lives are supposed to look, even just socially and personally. And so when you're 25 and you don't have your dream job, and you're 25 and you don't have your dream job, and you haven't met the person who's going to complete you and make all of these things happen, it's this like extra layer of pressure.
100%. I know markers of achievement like grades or job titles and LinkedIn updates and all that good stuff. I know that contains a tremendous amount of pressure. But I also think that the social script of what it means to do things on a quote unquote ambitious, together, accomplished, confident timeline is incredibly detrimental. I think that first of all, it completely divorces people from their context. I think that when we look at, young adults aren't moving out at the same rates they used to. They aren't getting married. They aren't doing all of these things. There are very valid reasons that is happening. And when we don't look at the whole picture, the economic context, the cultural and societal context, all of these factors, we're missing half the story, which is important. And we're making so many people feel guilty about not following a timeline that they did not set for themselves.
Right.
I've often thought about this in the context of feeling behind, which is something that I think dominated my entire 20s. I'm behind. I can't articulate who I am behind or what I am racing toward, but I know I'm running out of time. And I think a lot of the time that gets positioned as something that's supposed to motivate and inspire us. And I know that, just speaking for myself, it made me completely freeze. I'm behind at work. I'm not married. I don't have kids. I haven't figured out what I'm doing with my life, even though I'm living my life every day. I'm doing something. And I think that it can create this cascade of kind of an identity crisis around what you're even supposed to be ambitious about.
I couldn't agree more. And the two things are often at odds anyway. I mean, that's sort of what I found in my life, is that being ambitious on a personal level and being ambitious sort of professionally or creatively, those two things don't always mix in a way that is like neat and livable for all, right?
I wanted to ask you about that because there's a scene in your incredible book, which I just love so much.
Oh, I love that they get to snuggle up back there together.
I think you're actually at a book signing, maybe. I might be thinking of something else, but you say, I'm going to do a bad paraphrase here, that you're having a good time. It was work, but it was work you enjoyed. And he was at home doing your work, and that you treated it that way too. And that felt like such an important layer to ambition, this idea of what we internalize about our own work. And I wondered if you could speak to that. Did you feel like your ambition was valued? Did you value it at that time?
I don't know that I did. There was a time where I saw it as a liability, or certainly an inconvenience. Like it's not necessarily easy to sort of mesh or braid trying to sort of be the primary caregiver of two kids and be able to do all the things, professionally and creatively that I wanted to do. And so it would have been, frankly, a lot easier on my marriage if I had just been like, it's not that important. I will just stay home. Like, I don't need to publish this book. I don't need to go on tour. I don't need to go to this college or accept this residency, or, if I had turned down opportunities, I think, and been less ambitious or less embracing of the opportunities, it would have been easier in my family. And I tried for a while. I really did. I mean, I really did, in order to make my marriage work, kind of scaled back and dialed down some of the things that I was doing. And then I realized it doesn't matter. Like, that's not really a long-term solution. If someone asks you to stop doing something that makes you feel like yourself, and that is a core part of you that has existed for a long time, even before that person was in your life, it's probably not salvageable once you've gotten to that conversation, right? But it's also not tenable. And the longer I've thought about it, the more I've been like, well, what kind of model is that for my children too, right? Like, what does it mean? What am I showing not only my daughter, but my son about not just ambition, but self-worth and autonomy and just self-confidence? If I say, okay, if you don't want me to do that, I won't. And to kind of stuff core parts of who I am and what I do. And I didn't want to give it up for me, but I also didn't want to give it up and be a kind of husk of a person, then trying to talk the talk to them about the kind of people I wanted them to grow up to be without walking the walk. Like, how can you tell your kids, like, you can do anything, go do it, believe in yourself, lean in, like, try, if you're not doing those things?
Oh, wow. Absolutely. And I don't know if spoiling a memoir is a thing. I don't want to spoil anything.
You can't spoil it.
You've not read the book yet. But I do think that there's a scene that I think of now all the time. I think of you in this scene. I think of versions of this that have unfolded in my own life, where you had this moment where you realized that your work was actually not the problem. In a lot of ways, your work was the solution and kind of the saving grace. And I wondered how that maps on to what you were just speaking to about this idea of self-worth, what you want to pass on to your children, how you just want to show up in the world for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. Like, ultimately, my writing saved us and saved our house, like, quite literally. And I feel like I've been able to sort of, I don't know, I hope, I mean, I guess time will tell. We'll see what they say when they're older, but I hope, model something for them that that's sort of like living a life with integrity and pouring myself into what matters to me without ever making them feel second best. I mean, they know I love them more than poems. I actually, I had a speaking engagement this afternoon at my child's school.
What was that like? I bet those
It
were
was, honestly, I was so nervous because I mean, I
Yeah.
talk all the time, but I've never given a presentation about writing to like 200 fifth graders. I spoke to all of the fifth graders in the entire school district. So it was a field trip. So they bussed them all to one school. And I went and talked about word choice and playing with words. And I led them through a writing activity. And we did all of this stuff, all of this to say, I, went to my son beforehand and said, if this will embarrass you, Wells, tell them no. A. If you don't want me coming to your school, just tell me. It's not going to hurt my feelings. And he was like, no, that'll be cool. You always talk out of town and I never get to see you talk. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to show you the slideshow and you can approve it. So if there's anything embarrassing or that you don't think your friends will get or whatever. So we walked through it together and he said, Mom, I tucked him in. And as I was leaving his bedroom, he said, Mom, listen, it's a good presentation. He said, if people are talking to their neighbors or like looking at their phones or like look bored or whatever, that's on them. It's not because it's not a good presentation. I mean, what could you want more? He's 11. Like, okay. So I did it today. It went really well. He like waved in the audience. The kids wrote, they had tons of questions. And I'll tell you, one of the questions a girl asked at the end, we were talking about becoming a writer and when you knew and what your inspiration was. And a girl asked, did anyone try to stop you?
Oh my gosh. First of all, what an incredible question.
What an incredible question. A 5th grade girl. Did anyone try to stop you? And so it gave me an opportunity to talk to her about the inner critic, right? And I said, honestly, if anyone ever tried to stop me, it was my shyness and the little voice inside me that said, nobody cares what you think. You're not good enough at this. You're not going to make it. And you shouldn't even try. And I had to sort of turn the volume of that voice down and talk back to it and believe in myself and keep going. And I hope you do too. And she was just like, I mean, but it just even that a 5th grader has this idea that we might have obstacles, right? As we try to sort of meet our goals, whatever those goals may be. I think that girl's going to really do something with her life. I'm saying it now.
What an incredible question. It sounds like your son should be hiring out his services to be manager, pep talk giver, professional. That is
I know. We call him the mayor because he's an extreme extrovert and has been talking to people in public since he was about 2 years old. So I think he has some sort of career in something that is public facing if he wants it.
incredible. And I think it's such a good point too about the inner critic. I think that one of the biggest challenges, even now, that I have is figuring out how to get out of my own way.
Oh my gosh.
How to realize that not everyone is thinking about me quite as much as my anxious little brain is thinking and worrying. I think some of this is I have obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm very open about that. That has obviously shaped my mental health in many ways, but also my writing in many ways. And I've had to get a lot more comfortable with the idea that bad things are going to happen. I am going to fail. I am going to say the wrong thing. I am going to make mistakes. I'm going to try and have a responsibility to try to learn from those, to do better, to take constructive criticism, to be in conversation with people who are kind enough to sit and do that work with me. But it's been a process, not to chalk it all up as well. It's a wash. I've done everything I could possibly do and it's a disaster. It's much more of a process than I feel like it was before, which is good.
Oh, I love that. And I don't know if there's like such thing as a spoiler for your book either, but I would love to hear you say a little bit about maybe what prompted the deep dive. I mean, it does seem like from your first book to this one, like I can see like, oh yes, like there does seem to be a progression, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what prompted the deep dive and maybe sort of how you exited the book a little different than you entered it, because I definitely feel like the writing of every book does that for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you enter the book as sort of one kind of human, and whether you want to or not, the making of the thing is transformative. It changes you in some way.
Oh, 100%. I think that I should say first, and I'll back my way into this answer, but I think I was changed so profoundly because of the people that I interviewed for this book. I think that all credit to them on number one, the book existing at all. But number two, I think that those conversations were just so profound and so instructive. And there are a couple people that I had the honor of talking to for that book that I truly think about almost every day. And it's either because I'm trying to remind myself of something they said that I wanted to carry into my own life. It's because the context of what they said popped up in my day-to-day, and I genuinely think about it all the time. But the funniest part about this book is that a kernel of it was popping around before the first book had even come out. And it was right kind of at that cusp period where the first book was done. I couldn't touch it anymore, which I really, really struggled with. I struggled with not being able to edit right up until something went up on a website, which is how I'm kind of used to working in journalism. And it was a perfect storm of that kind of being something that I'd completed but wasn't quite done, and we didn't know quite what was going to happen, and I'd never done it before, and honestly didn't even know what questions to ask someone about that process. And then the dissolution of a relationship, mental and physical health issues kind of all cascading at once and sort of spiraling faster than I could get my hands around them to try to treat them or solve them or even just kind of satisfy them for a moment. And before, when I'd gone through periods that felt dark or periods that felt hard, I found myself pivoting to work. I'd be like, I'm going to pitch an essay. I'm going to start this. I wonder if anyone's done this story. Maybe I could try it. And for whatever reason, that was not happening this time. I would kind of jokingly tell friends, it feels like my second gear is stuck. Like I can't push it into that second gear the way I used to. And it ended up thinking, I've lost my ambition, which would be fine, except what that thought quickly dovetailed into an epiphany I had truly not had before then was that I thought my ambition was the only good thing about me. I thought that ambition was the tool that I could use to make sure I was a good friend and that people liked me, that I was working as hard as I could and proving that I deserved anything. Ambition was the way I kind of held on and kept the pieces of the puzzle together. Of course, that is a myth. The puzzle pieces were not together. They were scattered all over the table and on the floor. But that's how I thought of it at the time. So it really felt like less of a work crisis and more of I fundamentally don't know who I am, and I don't know how to replace this thing that was holding me together in my life. And so initially I started talking to people about ambition because that's what I do. If I have an idea, the first thing I want to do is talk to someone else. How are you feeling about this? How are you thinking about this? Has this come up for you at all? And it started off as, have you lost your ambition? What does that feel like? Is ambition even something we need? And it changed a lot over the course of reporting. I don't think it became a book necessarily about losing ambition, but more about the different forms that ambition can take and what that looks like. So it started in a much more depressing, honestly, and scary space. And that's not to say that losing ambition is a bad thing. I think if we're honest, most of us have ambition or goals that kind of ebb and flow as different parts of our lives do. But I think that getting to report on how it impacted people, how there's so much to an ambition, that there's no version of what or who is considered ambitious or successful or too ambitious for that matter, that doesn't intersect with gender, race, class, able-bodiedness, capitalism, all of these things that are bound up in this idea of striving, specifically in America. I found that fascinating. And I could not stop reading about it. I could not stop talking to people about it. And I think out the other side, I landed on a much more expansive, imaginative definition of what ambition could be than what I started with. What I started with was very bound up in the idea of work. Yes, achievement is stressful. Yes, there's too much pressure on it. But what's new about that? And I think that what this taught me is that now I think that any way that we stand together and fight for a better world for each other is ambitious. I think there are so many examples of that right now. I think that anytime we pour care and intention and aspiration into something, thinking that something can be better for us, that it could be better for our neighbors, that we can show up and take care of each other, to me, that is ambitious. And before, I wouldn't have ascribed the word ambitious to that, but I think the biggest change is that I really do now.
I love that. I feel like I'm someone who cares a lot and tries hard. So I don't know that I would have ever described myself as ambitious when I was younger or even necessarily now, but I know I'm someone who cares a lot and who tries hard. It's sort of a work ethic thing for me. And I think the nexus of that is a kind of ambition, isn't it?
I think so. And I think ambition is such a tricky word, because I do think and totally understand that it can be thought of as a really capitalistic, competitive, I'm going to climb over top of you and push you on my way up the metaphorical ladder.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a version of that exists. One of the most interesting parts of reporting is that I went a little bit further into history in this book than I had gotten to do in the first one. And I found that there are so many different theories from researchers about where the roots of ambition even are, including people who traced it back to Roman politics, who traced it back to some versions of the Bible in regard to sin, others obviously who connect a lot of American ambition specifically to the impact of white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, all of these things. And I think that now when we stand back and look at it kind of through that broader lens of where it came from and how it shows up in our lives based on who we are, resources we've had access to, experiences we've had, I think that it's so much deeper than just trying to girl boss your way to the top. But I also think that that means it can be deeper in the other direction too, that there are so many people I talked to who were organizing their workplaces, or they were advocating for care infrastructure, they were practicing community care, and they were the ones that posed the question, why would this work not be thought of as ambitious? And right. I thought, exactly.
Like anything you want to do well or do better than you're doing it, isn't that a sort of ambitious frame of mind?
I think so. I think that any time that you're willing to invest care and your attention and part of yourself into something, to me, that is ambitious. I realize that's not everyone's definition. I think one of the coolest things about this is I do think it's something that we can define for ourselves and push back on the parts that feel limiting and expand the parts that don't. But I think that most of us could list off countless things in our lives, whether it's work, whether it's parenthood, whether it's showing up for our neighbors, whatever it is, that require that intention and that care. And I think that investment is what makes it ambitious.
I love that, because it's also a sort of reclaiming of the term. I think particularly for women, ambitious is such an ugly adjective. It's often used in a pejorative way, in a way that it is just not, frankly, for men. And so I love the idea of kind of like redefining it and therefore claiming it in that way.
I think that's so true, because I think that there's a lot of too in ambition, too ambitious. It's too much. You're wanting too much. And I think that, that really played out in the reporting too. I think that class is a huge factor in this. If you're striving above what you quote unquote should have, because we have no social safety net. You're supposed to work your way into security. I think race and whiteness play a huge role in who is thought of as an ambitious person in a good way. So not wanting too much, that's not pushing back too much. And honestly, I think the more we interrogate these things about the world we live in, I think that not only can we hopefully orient ourselves toward creating a more just and supportive world, I think hopefully we also get a little bit closer to what a true ambition feels like for us when we pull all these things away. What are we left with? What holds meaning? How do we want to show up in the world?
I love that. That seems like a healthy relationship with ambition, right? I mean, as opposed to an unhealthy relationship to ambition. So I'm curious. I didn't tell you that I would ask you this, but now that you've mentioned that you've been carrying around some of the words of the people that you talked about from this book, is there like one little anecdote or one person's voice that like really sort of lives in your head as you consider these things? I know I just put you on the spot.
No, there are truthfully so many, but the one that I think of truly honest to God every day is someone I spoke to for the book. For some context, Remy described a very multi-layered pressure of ambition and how it intersected with familial expectations as someone who is a first-generation American, a high-achieving family, how it intersected with their family's religion, identity, eventually with their work. All these things were kind of bound up in this idea of being an ambitious, high-achieving, accomplished person. And Remy told me about the idea that we're supposed to prove ourselves throughout our lives. And that was something that came up again in a familial and religious context for them. So that was kind of the lens through which they were looking at this. And they said, if you tell a child, prove yourself, that is what they are going to spend their life trying to do.
Oh.
And I remember I think it was a phone call, that interview, and I just sat in silence. There was dead air for probably 10 seconds because I thought that just captures so much of the heft of this, the limitations of this. If you tell a child, prove yourself, that's what they're going to try to do. And I think the follow-up question there is, for our children, for all of us, for our neighbors, our peers, our colleagues, what are we asking people to prove? And why are we forcing them to prove it that way? Because I think one of the things that emerged out of this reporting is that, in a lot of cases, if people had more resources and more structural support, they would be more ambitious about all kinds of different things. And so I think about that all the time.
Oh, I love that, because it makes me think you don't actually have to say directly to a child, prove yourself. I think, kids can hear that message. And frankly, we can hear that message from partners, from bosses, from coworkers, from our parents. I mean, this happens, right? Where we sort of read between the lines, and that's the message we receive. And then we spend our lives trying to be perfect. And what is the opposite of telling a child, prove yourself? It's unconditional love. It's, I don't care what grades you get. I love you anyway. I want you to do well, and I want you to try your best. But your place in my heart has actually no relationship at all to your report card or the kind of work you do in the world. It's really about the kind of human being you are. And that sounds like so kind of woo-woo and soft parenting as a Gen Xer, because I think we grew up in a very much a sort of like, you do things the right way, you get good grades, you join things, you do things. And that was certainly my kind of suburban Midwestern middle class upbringing. And even though I'm raising my kids in also a suburban middle class upbringing, I'm trying my best to kind of strip that away so that we don't have to have conversations about worth tied to extracurricular activities or achievement. I mean, because again, you're making a really good point. What does that say? What happens when one of your children is mentally ill? What happens when one of your children is disabled? What happens what happens then? Right? Like, what are those messages then?
And I think it goes back to the whole conception of ambition just being very narrow, something that only certain people are supposed to have. And I think the more we push back on that, the more we say, yes, ambition is great. Yes, if you have goals, going after them is great, but you're worthy even if you don't. You're worthy regardless. And that makes me think, I know we're coming up on time, but of something that I wanted to ask you. Ironically, this is more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
I'm going to allow it. I'm going to allow it.
Thank you. One of the things that I thought about when I read your memoir, and I think I even emailed you about this, I fan mailed Maggie, was this pressure of doing it all right, which I know you've spoken to a little bit this evening. things going according to plan, it happening in a certain order, and that equaling good, versus this idea that came through in the book really strongly for me, which was an idea of homecoming, of reclaiming yourself, of coming back to yourself. And I wondered if you had any thoughts for us on ambition and worth and all of these things in that context.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I really did. It's funny when you were describing your sort of perfect storm of things sort of falling apart. I was sitting over here thinking that's exactly what the end of my marriage felt like. I felt like an incredible failure because I built all the things. I did what I was supposed to do, right? Not necessarily in exactly the order that my parents would have hoped for, but I did all the things I was supposed to do. And so how could it go wrong, right? And then when it did go wrong, so what does that mean about who I am as a person? And so for me, that identity hit of, okay, if I built all these things and then a big part of that kind of collapsed, who am I? Who am I if I'm not someone's wife? Who am I if I'm now someone who is having to sort of do this thing alone? And also like, how do I do this really? Like, how do I do this by myself? With ambition, hopefully healthy ambition. But I've definitely come out. I mean, the person who sat down to write that memoir was a very scared person with innumerable questions about how to make a life for myself on the other side of this kind of implosion. And the person who like finished that book and turned it in, although I'm going to admit I was doing edits way later than I should have been doing, because like you, I can't let go. I'm like, no, I want to say this differently. I'm so much smarter than I was last month when you sent me the second proofs. I came out of this book thinking, well, first of all, the fact that I even got to write this book at all was such a weird hidden gift because it was really born from the worst thing that's ever happened in my life. And yet the experience of writing it was really a homecoming for me. It really solidified for me, sort of like, you know, that Audre Lorde quote, I am who I am doing what I came to do. It lives on a postcard on my desk. I'm looking at it right now. It made me sort of double down on that. Like, I am who I am doing what I came to do. And for me, that is a twofold thing. It's writing and it's mothering these two people. And those are the two things that I do, or at least do something in service of, you know, every day. I'm parenting every day. And if I'm not writing, I'm doing something in service of my writing, or I'm talking to writers or thinking or reading. So yeah, I don't know. I came out of it feeling stronger. You on the other side of this book, I assume too.
On the other side of this book, I don't know about stronger. That
Yeah.
remains to be seen. But I also don't necessarily think that being softer for me would be a bad thing. I think
Yep.
softer is probably a net win. I think that when I think about the things I do, the things I'm most ambitious for, it's much more oriented towards showing up as a human being and listening and slowing down to make sure that I am being ambitious as a friend, that I am being ambitious as a community member. It sounds silly to go through a checklist of the things that you want to be ambitious about, given the context of this conversation, but it really has helped me soften into an ambition that is more, how can I be of service to the things that matter to me? How am I showing up for the people I care about? And how do I learn to care for myself? Because that was a big question mark for a long time. That's still the work in progress, is what does it mean to be ambitious about things that matter to you without feeling like you're under a microscope of accomplishing something or figuring out what something ought to mean.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That is like the most genius way to go out.
That. I've got a lot of work to do over here. I
Thank
own
you.
that.
I mean, I feel like I need to write down soft as a net win and just put it someplace in my office. That's just genius. Thank you.
Rainesford and Maggie, what a sparky, fast-moving, complicated, simple conversation. Really, really, really appreciate the energy that both of you brought to the screen, as I'm sure so did the viewers. I want to remind everyone that we will be having an after hours with both Rainesford and Maggie. Talk about continue the conversation. Ask your own questions. Come pick the brains of these two incredible people. Tell your own stories. How do you get to come to after hours? Buy a copy of Rainesford's book or Maggie's book or both. I would recommend both, frankly. We've been putting in links in chat about how to do that through the bookstall. You'll get a registration link for after hours from there. We start after hours at 8:05 p.m., which is 5 minutes after we close out this webinar, and it'll last for 55 minutes. So it's another full hour, which is really pretty amazing. There were a couple of pretty interesting questions that came in ahead of time, and I'm going to kind of focus. I'm going to do a little meld of two of them together, both from Jerry and from Jennifer. And their question a little bit different, but kind of coming on a little bit the same piece. I'll kind of phrase it with Jerry's phrasing. He was talking about how much he enjoyed the conversation. He says he's reflecting on work that he does within jails, speaking to soon to be released adults in custody. He sees despair and weariness, hopelessness, uncertainty, certainly not ambition. So he says, if we flip things around, how can we inspire those who are struggling in their lives to find their ambitions? And what might that mean in this context? And Jennifer kind of puts another shading on this, which is that imagine if you're talking to someone who doesn't have ambition, but wants it because they believe that within ambition lies magic. What would you suggest to a person to inch closer and closer to feeling ambition? So they're kind of looking at a little bit of the inverse of some of what you're talking about, which is instead of that kind of, oh, I'm viewed as too ambitious. Do you have any insight, maybe particularly Rainesford from the reporting for your book? Do you have some sense as to, for those who wish to spark ambition, who are concerned about perhaps a depletion of ambition, where could that go for them?
Oh, this is such a fascinating question. I'll try to be brief. I could go on and on about this one. I think first
after hours, they can come and talk to you at after hours.
From the reporting, I do think that it's helpful to put ambition in the context of structures that squash it for certain people and the systemic limitations of what our own ambition can do. I think a lot of the time ambition is supposed to be the fix, the individualized solution to problems that are structural, that shape people's everyday lives. And I say that because I think it's really easy to feel like it's something broken about you. It's something you haven't done right. You haven't followed the right path. You haven't worked hard enough when there are a lot of other factors at play. Second of all, I think if ambition feels too overwhelming, if that feels too close to, let's go out today and find my life's purpose, and I don't know what that is. Something that came up in the reporting that I thought was very illuminating that people talked about was starting with curiosity. What makes you curious? What have you noticed about your community or in your own experiences that is a problem that you'd like to solve? Is there a solution that you can think of? If not, what would that look like? I think sometimes just starting with that nugget of what makes you interested can help ignite some curiosity, which I think in turn really ignites a lot of ambition.
I appreciate that. We have about a minute left. Maggie, did you want to jump in, add a thought in there?
No, I love that because I think it also speaks to sort of how can I be of service, which is not necessarily how we frame ambition a lot of the time. I think we often think of ambition as sort of like, how can I get ahead for myself? Mm-hmm. But I love, Rainesford, how you're framing this, which is what am I curious about? What do I notice? What do I see? How could I be of service? I think that in some ways like widens the aperture in a way that makes it like a more appealing path or concept for a lot of people who might be put off by the sort of me of the traditional viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate both those answers and those comments, and I know there's more that can be explored. I want to thank you again both for coming in and talking about this. Your books have this interesting Venn diagram overlap, which Rainesford very astutely determined, and we're so grateful, Maggie, that you accepted the invitation to come and join us tonight. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Hope we'll see you next week as well.